Failures. There's a lot of them, you're looking at one right now, but we're here to talk about something far more interesting. The last 10 years might have felt like they had the biggest failures in gaming history, yet they're not even as bad as you think. There was a game so bad, it almost killed the entire gaming industry. Now, we're not gonna be ranking failures based on vibes. To be fair, I've created 3 criteria, each of which will contribute to the game's final grade, S being the biggest gaming fails, and C being the underwhelming ones. As for the criteria, they are as follows. The disappointment, so how different the actual game was from the original promise. The damage done, so studios shutting down because of the failure, money lost in development costs, gamers wasting their money, overall, just the amount of suffering the game caused. And finally, cultural impact. So has it been forgotten, or is it being mentioned to this very day? Enough of the boring rules though. Let's get right into this tier list and take a look at some of the worst failures we've ever seen. Starting off with a game so bad, it ultimately led to Bethesda losing control of the IP just a few days ago. I'm of course talking about Fallout 76. 5 successful previous installments, one of which is considered a legend among RPGs. Teaser trailer comes out, country roads blasting, people are excited. Todd Howard walks out at E3 a few weeks after the teaser trailer, but something is wrong. Very wrong. Because he utters the words, "online only." Drops of sweat run across his forehead as he realizes that whilst the crowd may be cheering, they're not cheering for the game. They're cheering because they think it's one big fucking joke. But it isn't. So Todd does what he does best. Lie and create outrageous amounts of hype. 4 times the size of Fallout 4, 16 times the detail, I can't even show that on my hands, and a dynamic weather system. It's gonna have it all. Todd, now satisfied, confidently walks off the podium and the shit show is set in full motion. Release day comes around and NPCs are nowhere to be found. 16 times the detail? Not so much. 16 times the bugs? Just maybe. Okay, so the game is bad, but if you bought the Power Armor Edition, you get a nice helmet and a beautiful canvas bag. Wait, this isn't canvas, this is nylon. And it looks like complete shit. It was the gaming equivalent of being sold oregano instead of weed, and man were the fans angry. Overall, the game was a disappointment and all the promotion around it was a disappointment too. Then came the aftermath, and it was about as bad as it could get. Bethesda was immediately hit with a shit ton of refund requests, but because they were selling it on their own platform, they made a horrible mistake. They didn't have a clear refund policy. So they started giving out refunds to everyone and no one at the same time. You had a guy who had 19 hours of playtime getting a refund and a guy who had 30 minutes of playtime not getting a refund. You can't just do that, and soon enough, the storm began. Hundreds and hundreds of media articles started coming out about the unfair refunds until finally Bethesda was hit with a class action lawsuit. However, it eventually led to nowhere and Bethesda got away with it. What they didn't get away with though was the shitty nylon bag. Turns out it wasn't really a mistake. They did make those canvas bags, but they sent them out to influencers only, and they were hoping that regular people wouldn't notice the difference. But people did notice. They noticed a lot, and Bethesda was eventually forced to actually send those people the promised canvas bag. Eventually, after 67 months of waiting, they got the bags, and in the meantime, they got $5 worth of in-game store credit, which was so little they couldn't even afford the in-game version of the bag. Just from all of this, it should be clear that Fallout 76 deserves to go into the S tier as one of the biggest gaming disappointments ever. Right? Well, no. It was really just a lot of hype and really bad marketing. Behind the scenes, it wasn't even Bethesda's A team working on the game. It was an inexperienced B team that was constantly ignored whenever they asked for any sort of help with the game. Supposedly, Todd only visited a few times and completely ignored all of their pleas for help. A few anonymous developers later admitted that they were just tasked with releasing something whilst the A team was working on Starfield. It was a side project, blown way out of proportion because of one menace in E3. Still, 8 years later, the game is holding on. A few big patches and consistent updates, including one that finally added NPCs, kept the game alive with a humble player base. It's the perfect A tier. Had the A team worked on it instead, there would have been an argument for S tier. But as things stand, the game is as lukewarm as its rating. Speaking of lukewarm, if there was one game that would be the epitome of that word, it would be Concord. Our story begins in 2016. Overwatch is just released to amazing acclaim from both critics and players. Meanwhile, a studio called Firewalk gets the amazing idea to make the same game again. 5 years of development pass and Sony decides to establish a partnership. Just 2 years later, someone in the Sony boardroom snorted one too many and they straight up decide to buy the entire Firewalk studio. Finally, August 2024 comes around and the game is released. Sony calls it its golden child. 8 years in development, hundreds of millions spent, and it's predicted to remain a PlayStation staple for a long time. 1 day later, 697 peak concurrent players on Steam. The worst outcome. Sony obviously treats its Golden Boy studio with respect and immediately dissolves it, firing 174 people. 174 people spent 8 years developing a game with a peak of 697 players. The reputational and financial damage Sony suffered was so great, they immediately killed an entire studio and fired everyone. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on the damage done to developers is because everything else about the game is unremarkable. Concord never made any crazy promises or marketed itself as something else. It was simply born too late and cost $40 while its competitors were completely free. As for cultural impact, well, everybody forgot about it. Nowadays, there's a legend that if you say Concord 3 times in a row, nothing will happen because nobody knows what it is. And this makes Concord our first B tier. A game that caused incredible damage to developers, but nobody else seemed to care or remember. Which can't be said for our next game, as it left both a legacy behind and a scar on the gaming industry. The Cyberpunk aesthetic was waiting decades for a proper game. So when Cyberpunk 2077 was announced in 2013 to be developed by CD Projekt Red, gamers had finally something to be excited about. Out of all people, Keanu Reeves suddenly starts hyping up the game. You're breathtaking. At that time, his acting career was at its peak, so him becoming synonymous with Cyberpunk was a pretty big deal. The hype became the biggest in video game history, culminating in 8 million pre-orders before the game even released. That's 500 million in revenue. They made their money back before the game even came out. And when it released in December 2020, it hit the record for peak concurrent players on Steam. 1 million people were playing the game at the same time. For better or worse, Cyberpunk would keep breaking records, as after release, it would officially become the first AAA game to be taken off of the PlayStation Store. Shockingly, it was just a week after it released. Sony even decided to break its no refunds policy. It was pretty much the worst launch of all time. Expectations were huge, yet people received a game that was so horribly optimized and so buggy, it was unplayable. I remember playing Cyberpunk back then, and the game really was barely playable. My computer started burning halfway through the session, but if you look past all the glaring issues, there really was a good game underneath. And this was pretty much the essence of Cyberpunk in 2020. Was it disappointing? Yes, but underneath it all, there was one of the greatest stories in gaming history. Yet public outrage was so strong, not even a good story could save the game, and the studio got in big trouble. Investors sued CD Projekt Red for misleading them. They thought it was an unfinished game, masquerading as a finished product. CDPR stock dropped by 25% in 1 day, and the founders lost $1 billion in net worth. So a race began. Fix the game, save your studio's reputation, save it from the lawsuits, save face, or be forever remembered as scammers. But it's not 2020 anymore, it's 2026 and Cyberpunk has had huge cultural impact. It's remembered as one of the best modern RPGs. Which is surprising. For a game that caused a lot of disappointment, it managed to improve so much that people forgot it even needed a redemption in the first place. And this is all thanks to Update 2.0. A free update, which turned Cyberpunk into the game it should have been at launch. And Phantom Liberty, a paid DLC which was amazing. When you sum it up, Cyberpunk sounds horrible. A game so bad that it was taken off of the PlayStation Store, investors sued the developers, and owners lost billions. Yet it had a comeback so impressive, people don't even remember its failure. Combined with the influence of Cyberpunk edge runners, which led tens of millions of people towards Cyberpunk 2077, and we are witnessing the birth of a new franchise right before our very eyes. Taking all of this in, it's an undeniable S tier. A game that had the worst launch of all time, yet it managed to redeem itself and lives in everyone's head rent-free to this very day. Okay, but this ranking is getting a bit stale, so it's time for a special lighting round. Let's go back to May 2016. Battleborn and Overwatch have just released back-to-back, and Paladins also joins the party, albeit a little bit late. Each of these games is a handful, but combined, they make me want to pull my hair out. Or, well, made me. What's done is done. Starting off with the most lackluster, Paladins. Now, it's not the worst game out of the three, but it never had its chance to shine either. It lived in Overwatch's shadow constantly, and most people dismissed it as a cheap clone. Now, what separated Paladins from the rest is that you could assign special decks to each of your heroes, and these card decks fundamentally changed how you played them. For example, I hate playing support, but I actually mained one in Paladins because the game allowed me to build a deck that could turn him into a DPS. My teammates did not like that very much. However, in 2017, Paladins would absolutely annihilate this deck building system because they made the cards upgradable, which in turn made it incredibly pay to win. But they did eventually backtrack a few months later and compensated the community in a way that left everyone satisfied. The game would continue to survive, but never thrive. It would be always considered Overwatch's weird cousin, and for that reason, it gets the C tier. A game that was good and never really disappointed anyone. Okay, enough yapping, let's up the pace. Battleborn. I genuinely feel bad for this game. It was in development earlier than Overwatch, yet it was completely overshadowed by it. 12,000 peak players doesn't sound that bad until you realize that Overwatch was pulling in millions. To top it all off, Battleborn cost 20 more bucks than Overwatch. No one in their right mind would buy it. So people either chose Overwatch, or when they didn't have money, Paladins. I wish I had more to say, but I don't. B tier. Finally, Overwatch. It's a great game, right? Well, the 2016 version was, but that's not the one I'm talking about. I'm talking about Overwatch 2, or just Overwatch now because they removed the 2, so people don't have any false expectations about there being an Overwatch 3, which is kinda ironic because Overwatch 2 was built on those false expectations for the campaign. Overwatch 2 was such a fucking disappointment, they removed the 2 so they won't have to deal with the fact that it's a failed sequel. It's arguably one of the biggest disappointments on this tier list in terms of broken promises, but at the same time, Blizzard just re-released the same game and that didn't cost them that many resources, and people didn't care either because they could still play Overwatch. It goes to the B tier. And this concludes our lightning round. 3 very similar games with 3 completely different fates. But we're not done yet. The most interesting failures are still ahead of us. The next game on this list isn't just a disappointment. It's the most unique game on this tier list, and that's because it comes from an era and a place where money wasn't the primary motivator. Shenmue was created to replicate day-to-day life, and unlike 2020 Cyberpunk, which promised to do the same but initially failed to do so, Shenmue actually pulled it off. 250 NPCs, each with their own individual routine. The creator, Yu Suzuki, even determined all of their blood types, and to top it all off, the game uses real weather data from 1986 Japan. And while this sounds amazing, it's also the game's biggest problem. The premise of Shenmue is that you're a young martial artist whose father was murdered right in front of his eyes for a magical artifact. Sounds exciting, right? Well, yes, but it's also the only thing exciting about the game. Like I said, it was created to replicate day-to-day life. You don't fight through waves of enemies to reach the final boss. You ask the people around your village for directions and information. You don't collect money from dead enemies, you earn it from your part-time job. You are forklift certified, by the way. Shenmue's biggest strength is also its biggest weakness. But Shenmue never promised to be an action-packed game. Shenmue wanted to replicate ordinary life, and it did exactly that with beautiful graphics for 1999. It wasn't enough, and the studio would suffer devastating consequences. Unfortunately, all that immersion came with a price. Shenmue was the most expensive video game made in history at that time, and even though it sold 1.2 million copies on the Dreamcast, it still wasn't enough. In fact, it would never be enough. Even if every Dreamcast owner bought 2 copies, they still wouldn't make a profit. The financial loss was so big, Sega abandoned the Dreamcast and left the console business forever. Culturally, it's a bit of an oddball, more on the niche side of things, but it still has a fan base that's very dedicated. Shenmue is practically the godfather of all RPGs and the inventor of the interact with anything you can see mechanic. It's a one-of-a-kind game that was born to fail in every single way, yet it accomplished what it set out to do. By our criteria, it's a failure. By my heart, it's a winner. A tier. Now this next entry is a bit special because it was all caused by one man, yet it's called No Man's Sky. No Man's Sky undisputably tops this tier list in terms of disappointment. What makes it interesting is that it was all unintentionally caused by Sean Murray. Sean became the face of the game whilst it was still in development, and while he was a great developer, he was a horrible marketer. Add on top the fact that he's a huge introvert.
Is it super nerve-wracking to talk on stage at E3?
Yes. Yes, definitely.
And you have someone who would, under pressure, promise just about anything to not disappoint anyone.
I worry about disappointing people.
So he started promising, and he promised so much they would need years and years of further development just to actually add those features.
Will I get bored playing this game?
No.
Will you be able to play with your friends?
Yeah.
Can you grief other players?
A little bit.
This went on for 3 years, and along with a rush release and a price that convinced people it was a AAA game, the expectations were massive and disproportionate for a team of just 13 people. Was it mostly their fault? Yes. But when a team of 13 people promises a game with 18 quintillion planets, I don't even know how many zeros that is, you should probably know that something is wrong, no matter how much bullshit Sean says on those interviews. Still, sooner or later, the promises would catch up to him, and on August 9th, 2016, the day would come. No Man's Sky officially released, and well, the game was a bug-filled mess that didn't even achieve 20% of what was promised. The main selling point, multiplayer, was a complete lie, and what made it so much worse is that the developers didn't even admit it. 2 players spawned in the same solar system, so they decided to stream themselves going to a specific planet and meeting in a specific spot, and when the moment came, they were all alone. And that was the extent of disappointment. The main feature was not there. Now, in terms of suffering and damage, what ensued was probably the greatest amount of hatred ever seen on the internet, with Sean receiving countless death threats and personal visits to the studio. And if that wasn't enough, UK's Advertising Standards Authority started investigating them for false advertising. This was a genuine real-life horror story for Sean and his team. However, it would eventually turn into a legendary story of redemption. You see, it got so bad it couldn't get any worse. People cursed Hello Games for making the game and either refunded it or listed it on eBay for $1. So the easy choice would be to take the money and run. They were a small team, just 13 people, yet they earned $80 million. That was life-changing money. So life-changing, all that hatred didn't even matter. But where others saw an easy way out, Sean saw a way to redeem himself. He redirected all the hateful internet traffic to his computer and got to work. His instructions for the team were simple. Keep your heads down, fix the game, then add everything that's missing. And keep their heads down they did. Complete silence from the Twitter account, even worse than when I tried Tinder for the first time. First, people got even more angry. How dare they ignore us? Then the fear came. They took the money and ran. finally the patches came. They fixed all the game-breaking bugs and the way was cleared for content updates. What ensued was both impressive and unusual. Consistent huge updates including base building, new vehicles, story, all the way to multiplayer itself eventually being added in July 2018. But it didn't stop there. The game is receiving content updates to this very day, and it probably won't stop until Sean's kind British soul finally decides it redeemed itself. But that decision doesn't seem to be anywhere in sight, and No Man's Sky is here to stay, not only as the game it once promised to be, but as something even better. Unlike Cyberpunk, which hides its uncomfortable past, No Man's Sky embraces it and uses it to motivate itself to be the greatest space exploration game ever. A heartwarming ending like this deserves nothing less than S tier. And with that, we're finally done. Hold on, I'm forgetting something. Oh, it's time we talked about E.T., or the so-called worst game ever, but is it really? We've seen a fair amount of failures, so now it's up to us to decide if E.T. even deserves that title. Now, the E.T. movie needs no introduction. Even as a Gen Z, the image of the alien's weird-ass finger glowing is engraved into my mind, although I'm not sure if that's a good thing. The plan was as follows. The E.T. movie released in June 1982. The game starts immediately being worked on and is finished by Christmas. It becomes the perfect Christmas gift and parents and kids all over the world buy it. Unfortunately, everything went to shit before development even started. Developer Howard Scott Warshaw only had 5 weeks to design and develop the entire game. In that day and age, about 6 months of development was the norm. He had 5 weeks, which was an insane deadline, especially for one person. And to top it off, he had 1 day to invent a concept and sell it to Steven Spielberg. But Warshaw didn't make things easy for himself either. Spielberg straight up told him, just make a Pac-Man clone. But Warshaw really wanted to make an item collecting puzzle game, and Spielberg let him. Now, what makes the E.T. game particularly interesting is that gamers weren't the only ones who were disappointed. Atari had to physically produce the cartridges, which was the reason for the horrible deadline, and their expectations were insane. 4 million cartridges, and that took about 2 months to produce. Negotiating a license in the first place was also a mess, and it dragged on for months too. To put it simply, everything around the game took longer than the game itself. Back to expectations. Not only was Atari shooting out a record amount of cartridges, because the movie was a phenomenon, people were excited, and combined with the Christmas timed release, it was supposed to be the perfect Christmas gift. However, kids were shocked to find a convoluted, buggy mess of a game under their Christmas tree instead of a simple Pac-Man clone. The game itself was incredibly ugly. It was covered in this disgusting shade of green, it had no connection to the movie whatsoever, and E.T. moved by stretching out his neck and flying. Just thinking about this game makes me feel pain all over my body. In terms of sales, they managed to sell over 2.6 million cartridges in the span of a year. However, more than 600,000 were eventually returned. In total, they barely sold half. Atari netted a 100 million loss, which bombed their earnings, destroyed their stock price, and eventually led to them losing 500 million in 1983. Okay, so one gaming company is fucked. Whatever. Yeah, but at that time, Atari was the entire gaming industry. There was no one else. If Atari goes bankrupt, the entire gaming industry goes bankrupt. And in 1984, exactly that happened. One bad deadline and one bad concept were so overestimated, they ended up destroying everything. However, this was 44 years ago. Culturally, it's a faded memory by now. But in 2014, a few people were like, hold on, what happened to those unsold cartridges? So they did a bit of research and ended up in New Mexico, and lo and behold, those poor little things were buried inside a landfill. The greatest irony is that they auction off those cartridges for hundreds of thousands of dollars. So even culturally, E.T. left a mark by destroying the environment, something every other game on this tier list has yet to achieve. Is it the worst game ever? Warshaw himself said that he doesn't mind the title, so I say yes. And with that, we have a winner. The biggest gaming failure of all time. The worst of the worst, a tier of its own. And this marks the end of our tier list. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe so I know at least someone is on the other side. other than the voices.